Um, well, welcome back to the next session. Today, I'll be discussing some of the research that I'm completing for a book that I plan on finishing by the end of the summer, entitled Intellectual World War. And I thought that the best way to present it would be to give you a sense of the kind of overall architecture of the book, but then also some of the method deployed. And then I'd also like to share three examples that will kind of illustrate the fundamental intervention that I'm making. And I imagine that will take anywhere between 40 and 50 minutes, and then we'll open it up and have plenty of time for discussion. So first and foremost, I'd like to say that the overview that I'm going to provide of the intellectual world war is the result of a long kind of self-critique that I've engaged in. And I was trained in the traditions of French theory and Western Marxism, but I never really learned a proper material history of these traditions and how they're situated within global class struggle. So after spending about 2 decades studying them, including over a decade that I spent in Paris studying with some of these leading luminaries of French theory, I spent at least another decade developing my analysis from the level of subjective self-critique, in which I was critical of my own ideological composition, to that of objective ideological criticism, meaning an analysis of the very system that had produced me as an ideological subject, and a lot of other people, a lot like me, who were convinced that traditions of thought like French theory or German-style critical theory or contemporary versions of radical theory were making a useful contribution to analyzing and potentially transforming the world. I'm sure many people know the adage that if you give someone a fish, they eat for a day. But if you teach them how to fish, they'll eat for life. Similarly, if you provide someone with a subjective ideological critique, they'll be able to apprehend ideology in a specific instance, such as my own. Whereas if you demonstrate to them how the system works that produces ideological subjects in general, they'll be able to apply that to myriad instances while also coming to an understanding of where the system comes from and how it can be overcome. This form of objective ideological criticism, or general, systematic, universal ideological criticism, is precisely the goal of this series of books. And its focal point is the Western left intelligentsia, and more specifically, what I'll call compatible critical theory, meaning theory that's compatible with capitalism and imperialism. I say a series of books because originally this was going to be one book. It ended up that I had so much material that it would be calculated over 500 pages. And so I had the opportunity to turn it into a trilogy. So there'll be 3 separate volumes that will be published sequentially. So Marx and Engels understood that intellectual production functioned like an industry, and that it was therefore necessary to analyze it from the point of view of the social relations of theoretical production. This series of books focuses very specifically on what Marx described as 2 parts of the superstructure. Marx claimed that there's the politico-legal superstructure made up of the bourgeois state and the legal apparatus, but then also social consciousness. So the religion, morality, philosophy, and culture of a particular society. Sorry, there's an echo on my part. Oh, I think, okay, now it should be okay. There was just someone who was unmuted. Sorry about that. So given the fact that Marx and Engels were writing in the 19th century, we have the advantage of well over a century of historical perspective. So in an effort to further develop dialectical and historical materialism within the current conjuncture, this series of books seeks to draw on this perspective in order to elucidate the evolution of the 2 intertwined components of the superstructure that I was just mentioning in the imperial core. So regarding first and foremost the political legal apparatus, it has increasingly developed a division of labor between the visible form of legal government that administers the spectacle of public politics on the one hand, and a largely invisible government that manages capitalist social relations, often through illegal means, on the other. As Annie Lacouarie has explained, the increasing concentration of wealth under monopoly capitalism has required greater recourse to the men and women of the shadows. The arrival of socialism on the world's historical stage, which poses an existential threat to capitalism, has exacerbated the need to rely on covert mechanisms of governance, particularly due to the fact that the governments of the imperial core have attempted to maintain their hegemony by presenting themselves as democracies rather than plutocratic oligarchies. The bourgeois state, under these conditions, has thus increasingly developed its dark underside. The fact that Vladimir Lenin and Leon Trotsky were both, for a few days in the spring of 1917, in the custody of the networks of the United Kingdom's recently minted secret intelligence service, also known as MI6, which was also involved in a planned anti-communist coup d'etat against the Soviet Union, provides insight into how important shadow government became in the monopoly imperialist phase of the war on communism. Bourgeois political science focuses almost exclusively on overt forms of governance, and there's no extant discipline in the capitalist world for studying the governmental agencies engaged in the dark arts of covert operations. To take but one revealing example, David N. Gibbs undertook an analysis of all the articles published between 1991 and 2001 in 5 of the most prestigious journals in the field of political science. He found that, apart from a rare paragraph or perhaps a sentence or two, they contain no mention of CIA covert operations. Covert actions have been effectively expunged from the record. This is a quote from Gibbs, citing the additional fact that a significant number of social scientists, especially political scientists, regularly work with the Central Intelligence Agency, including, of course, today. Gibbs has been doing important work to bring to light the ways in which bourgeois social sciences have served to whitewash the sordid history of U.S. foreign policy. More generally, former CIA officer turned university professor Richard Smith aptly pointed out that, quote, not a single university in the United States fosters a serious research effort into the organization and activities of the intelligence community, that massive bureaucratic conglomerate that has played such a major role in our foreign policy, end quote. Bourgeois knowledge production is thus complicit in covering up the crimes of the US national security state and empire building, whose breadth and depth boggle the imagination. For instance, according to the meticulous calculations of 14 former members of the Central Intelligence Agency, the CIA was responsible for the death of at least 6 million people in 900 major operations and 3,000 minor operations between 1947 and 1987. If one assumes the same pace, these numbers would have doubled by 2017. And these are only direct deaths, of course. This veritable third world war, to use John Stockwell's apt expression, is rarely, if ever, so much as registered within the realm of bourgeois knowledge. This 3-volume book that I'm completing this summer draws on extensive archival research and innumerable Freedom of Information Act requests, as well as a very large body of scholarship based on archival research and first-person testimonies of those involved in covert operations, in order to both overcome the limitations of bourgeois knowledge and demonstrate the superior explanatory power of dialectical and historical materialism regarding how the bourgeois state actually functions in the imperial phase of capitalism. The second focal point for this book series is on the sector of the superstructure that formats social consciousness, with particular attention paid to its industrial scale development in the contemporary world. This superstructure, as the name suggests, is not simply the result of ideologies that are organically produced through class relations. While arising from class dynamics, these ideologies are structured and organized through a powerful institutionalized system that forges and formats subjects in every aspect of their being, including their consciousness, but also their values, affects, perceptions, practices, desires, and drives. This sector of the superstructure includes all of the cultural, religious, educational, media, intellectual, and other institutions that compose people as ideological subjects and direct their activities, as well as the entire material system by which cultural productions, in the broadest sense of the term, circulate and are consumed. In the imperialist phase of monopoly capitalism, especially in its latest form. The superstructure is so highly industrialized and centralized that it arguably exercises an awesome degree of power never before seen in history. To take but one telling example, journalist Alan MacLeod claimed in 2019 that, quote, 5 gigantic corporations control over 90% of what America reads, watches, or listens to, end quote. The dark underside of the politico-legal superstructure has been much more deeply involved in consolidating the cultural and intellectual sector of the superstructure than most people are aware. And this fact clearly demonstrates the central importance of a dialectical approach that does not reify these two elements of the superstructure as separate components, but rather conceptualizes them as intertwined forces. Again, the two components are the kind of political legal mechanism and the apparatus of the cultural apparatus that formats social consciousness. Cultural production under capitalism, like intellectual production more specifically, is characterized by a fundamental contradiction. It has to appear to be free and open to all, based on the principles of democratic meritocracy, while actually being very tightly controlled from behind the scenes in order to enforce the dominant ideology. It is for this reason that capitalist states have developed powerful propaganda and disinformation agencies, which, through covert operations, have been deeply but discreetly involved in the system of intellectual and cultural production, distribution, and consumption. This is indeed one of the key functions of the intelligence agencies of imperialist states. They are involved in an intellectual world war. As Ralph McGehee explained, based on 25 years of experience as a CIA case officer, quote, the CIA is not an intelligence agency. As the covert action arm of the president, the CIA uses disinformation, much of it aimed at the US public, to mold opinion, end quote. William Casey, CIA director from 1981 to 1987, explained what this meant in concrete terms during a meeting with newly elected President Ronald Reagan, when he was asked, Casey that is, to explain the goal of his agency, the CIA. Quote, we'll know our disinformation program is complete when everything the American public believes is false, end quote. In this regard, ideology is not only a byproduct of the material relations of production. It is also forged, maintained, and overseen by an ensemble of institutionalized forces that condition social life. Although all metaphors have their limits, we might say that ideology is both pushed by the economic base, which is its driving force, and pulled by the superstructure, which itself grows out of the infrastructure. In order to materially demonstrate the dialectical relationship between the infrastructure and the superstructure, the study that I'm working on proposes a political economy of knowledge that details the intricate relationships between the capitalist base, the political legal superstructure, the cultural intellectual sector of the superstructure, and the subjects of knowledge production and consumption. For the purposes of this work, the focal point is much more specifically on the academic side of the intellectual apparatus, meaning the industrialized system of theoretical production, circulation, and consumption that governs the professional academic intelligentsia and forms a key component of the superstructure. So the political economy of knowledge, which is integral to my entire analysis, allows us to track the impact of political and economic forces on the types of knowledge that are produced, widely circulated, and consumed. It also sheds light on which forms of knowledge are excluded from support, marginalized, and targeted for widespread discrediting or even elimination. As we'll see, multiple forces have been at work in the political economy driving the intellectual sector of the superstructure in the imperial core. Universities have, of course, been key since they are major corporations involved in the production and dissemination of knowledge. The same, of course, is true of think tanks and various intellectual organizations and associations. The publishing industry has been equally central for its importance in the distribution and consumption of knowledge, and the mass media has played a major role, as well as culture industries more broadly. The capitalist ruling class, which controls and oversees all of the institutions I just mentioned, has also interceded rather directly by using its foundations to exercise its dominion over intellectual life. In doing so, it has often worked hand in glove with state agencies. This intimate relationship between the bourgeoisie and the bourgeois state is absolutely essential to understand for everything that follows in my analysis, because they are the two principal forces at work within the political economy of bourgeois knowledge production. So this provides you with some of the kind of general foundational landscape for my intervention, which focuses largely on the on the superstructure and the forces that are driving it within the imperial core. More specifically, however, I focus on a group of theorists that I refer to as compatible critical theorists. So one of the fundamental ideological objectives of the capitalist ruling class in the imperialist phase has been to isolate, discredit, and attempt to crush the communist left. This has proven to be particularly difficult, given the ability on the part of communists to address the most serious problems facing the working and oppressed masses of the world. One of the key tactics that has been developed by the imperialist powers has been to support the socialists over and against the communists. And socialists can be Trotskyist, social democrats, libertarian socialists, liberal socialists. There's many different versions of this, but what's fundamental is an opposition to communism understood as actually existing socialism. Thomas W. Braden, who played a central role in the US national security state's propaganda efforts in Western Europe, particularly in the wake of World War II, provided a frank insider's account of its tactics in an article that was clearly vetted by his colleagues in the Central Intelligence Agency. Quote, in much of Europe in the 1950s, socialists, people who called themselves left, the very people who many Americans thought no better than communists, were the only people who gave a damn about fighting communism, end quote. He therefore used the unlimited funds at his disposal as the director of the International Organizations Division to clandestinely support a vast array of activities of the compatible left, including political parties, unions, news outlets, intellectual platforms, individual intellectuals, etc. My books focus on the intellectual and particularly the academic front of this war on communism, and more specifically, the endeavor to shore up a form of compatible left critical theory over and against the communists. Since it has not been possible to simply eliminate Marxism due to its broad public appeal, its clear explanatory power, and its proven ability to transform society, the managers of bourgeois society have been faced with the dilemma of how best to deal with its existence. As we shall see, their preferred tactic has been to use their monopoly control over the superstructure to internationally promote a commodified version of Marxism, often referred to as Western Marxism or cultural Marxism, as well as forms of edgy theory that purport to surpass Marxism in their radicality and sophistication. If we simplify things to the extreme, we can say that the mantra of the imperial theory industry has been, if you cannot beat your competitors, the actual Marxists, then flood the market with seductive but cheap knockoffs, promote them to no end, and bury your competitors as passé. So like many other bourgeois cultural products, this compatible critical theory has sometimes formulated significant critiques of capitalism. If we situate these within the objective world, it makes perfect sense to ask a very simple and practical question that is very rarely raised in academic circles. If capitalism is recognized by these forms of compatible critical theory as having negative effects, what is to be done about it? And the traditions of compatible critical theory that I'm thinking of are primarily Frankfurt School style critical theory in all four of its generations, French theory, as well as the kind of radical forms of theory influenced by these two kind of foundational reference points of the Western left intelligentsia. So this could include anything from, the work of contemporary figures like Alain Badiou and Slavoj Žižek, to the work of Michael Hart and Antonio Negri, to that of Giorgio Agamben, Judith Butler, Wendy Brown, and many others. And I'm happy to enter into kind of the details of the analysis later on in the discussion if people would like. What is unique about this kind of tradition of thought that I'm referring to as compatible critical theory is that the deeper one mines down into the lives and work of these purportedly radical theorists, sifting through their deliberate obscurantism, the more obvious their response to the question, what is to be done, becomes clear, and the easier it is to understand their primary social function. They are indeed sometimes critical of capitalism, and some of them openly celebrate jacqueries or small islands of resistance, while others embrace capitalist social democracy. What they all agree on, however, is that there is no alternative, in the sense of a concrete project of collectively building a socialist world that could eventually overcome capitalism. What is more, any of their criticisms of the capitalist world pale in comparison to their uncompromising condemnation of actually existing socialism. Their brand of radical theory ultimately leads, implicitly or explicitly, to a politics of capitalist accommodation, since socialism in the real world is judged to be far worse than the extant capitalist order. They therefore proffer what we might call ABS theory, anything but socialism. The theorists examined in this series of books, then, who are all anti-communists, have exercised their agency in dedicating themselves to specific political and ideological struggles. Many of them have worked very explicitly within the tradition of Friedrich Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger in order to combat Marxism. And a few have directly participated in anti-communist subversion operations. Jacques Derrida in Czechoslovakia, as we'll see in a moment, Michel Foucault in Poland, Slavoj Žižek in Yugoslavia. Some have worked directly for the US national security state, including 6, yes, you heard me right, 6 members of the Frankfurt School. And figures like Herbert Marcuse have been at the center of the anti-communist intellectual world war run by imperialist states and the capitalist ruling class. Others have primarily participated in the ideological and cultural efforts to discredit communism, with the support of the capitalist class and within the CIA's knowledge networks, as is clearly visible in the work of Theodor Adorno and Max Horkheimer, as well as later figures in the Frankfurt School. Still others, like Alain Badiou, Žižek, Negri, Hart, and those working within forms of radical theory that became very popular in the early 21st century, have presented themselves as the only real communists by advocating for a mysterious third way beyond capitalism and socialism. Although they are critical of the former, capitalism, they condemn the latter in the most resolute terms, albeit through references at times to minor exceptions, such as the Chinese Cultural Revolution for Badiou, that confirm this fundamental rule. They've positioned themselves on an idealist stairway to heaven in an attempt to convince their readership that a magical path transcends the terrestrial class struggle between imperialism and actually existing socialism. So a significant portion of these books explores and elucidates the objective social forces that have encouraged and fostered these types of activities. However, it is absolutely essential to recognize and account for the agency of those involved. And much of what I outline is dedicated to tracking this in great detail. After all, the intellectuals who succeed and advance within the imperial theory industry have often worked very hard in order to do so. Far from acting as simple automatons, they've met the system halfway, a third of the way, or some other ratio. In doing so, they've received uplift in return, meaning opportunities to advance within the intellectual establishment by securing prestigious and lucrative academic appointments, publishing in premier outlets, gaining a large public following, having their work immediately translated and very widely, being invited on international junkets, having access to mainstream media, and ultimately occupying a position in the pantheon of bourgeois history. It is not the least bit surprising in this regard that these intellectuals have been so widely supported and promoted within the capitalist world and its imperial theory industry. In order to shore up the compatible, non-communist left over and against the threat of actually existing socialism, what better tactic than to champion scholars like these as some of the most important, even the most radical thinkers of the contemporary world? Critical theory, and even Marxism, can thereby become redefined as a kind of anti-communist radical theory that is not directly connected to class struggle from below, but rather freely criticizes all forms of domination, including so-called authoritarian socialism, and which ultimately sides with capitalist control societies over and against the purported fascist horrors of powerful socialist states. Fascist here is a quote from Max Horkheimer. In this regard, the group of compatible left theorists promoted by the imperial theory industry have played the role of radical recuperators in both senses of this expression. They occupy the left radical fringe of capitalist recuperation, and they help recuperate potential radicals who are seeking system change. What they have on offer, and this is one of the reasons why they have been so widely marketed within the imperial theory industry, are discourses whose revolutionary symbology belies their counter-revolutionary substance. So with this framing in mind, in the next 15 to 20 or 30 minutes, I'd like to just touch on 3 examples that will give you access to a little bit more of the kind of details of the analysis. And I've chosen examples from each of the volumes of the books. The first volume will focus on the kind of intellectual world war in general and provide a methodological framing to the project as a whole. But the second half of the book focuses on Frankfurt School critical theory. The second volume focuses on French theory, and the third volume focuses on contemporary versions of radical theory that come out of German and French style critical theory. So the example from the first volume is Marcuse, whom I refer to as the well-paid piper of Western Marxism. I mentioned before that a number of figures in the Frankfurt School worked for the US national security state, in particular the OSS, which was the predecessor organization to the Central Intelligence Agency. And most accounts of the Frankfurt School talk about their exile in the United States in terms of a relocation to New York because Columbia housed the Institute for during their exile. But if you actually count the number of figures, 8 are usually those who are considered to be part of Horkheimer's inner circle. 5 of them would be better referred to as the Washington School because they worked for the US national security state. And they didn't work for a short amount of time. Someone like Marcuse spent a decade working for the US national security state. And when he went into the academy, he went into what are largely recognized as Central Intelligence Agency cutouts, meaning the Russia Institute at Harvard and Columbia. Marcuse was accused during his lifetime of being a CIA agent and having connections to the agency, which of course has a rather sordid history. Marcuse claimed that he worked for the OSS, and in a well-known interview with Jürgen Habermas, he said it's ridiculous, this idea that he collaborated with the CIA, quote, since the OSS wasn't even allowed near the CIA. They, meaning the OSS and the CIA, fought each other like enemies. Now, the OSS was officially terminated in 1945, and the CIA was not established until 1947. So it's impossible for them to have been in a fight with one another because they never existed at the same time. This is only the first small sign of Marcuse's lack of or being disingenuous. So perhaps to be fair, what Marcuse really meant was he was talking about the research and analysis branch, which is where he worked in the OSS. When the OSS was dissolved, there was a kind of complicated reshuffling that took place, and his research and analysis branch eventually ended in the State Department, right? So perhaps what he meant then is that the research and analysis branch of the State Department didn't work with the Central Intelligence Agency. However, if he had read his own job description, which I've read because it's published in the Register of the Department of State in 1948, and it lists on the exact same page that the acting chief of the Central European branch was no other than Herbert Marcuse, then he would have known that his research and analysis branch was described as, quote, being responsible for planning and implementing a program of positive intelligence research pertaining to all of continental Europe to meet intelligence requirements of the department in the formulation and execution of foreign policy, and I'd like to underscore this, the intelligence requirements of the Central Intelligence Agency and other authorized agencies, end quote. So according to Marcuse's own job description, the Central Intelligence Agency was dependent upon the research and analysis that he was doing in the State Department. Moreover, we have internal documents in which Marcuse himself demanded of his employees in the State Department that they pursue research into the ideological and political differences in the communist world with the highest degree of urgency because, quote, the P sector and CIA were absolutely dependent upon it. The P sector refers to propaganda agencies, where some of his friends from the Frankfurt School were working, in particular in Voice of America. Tim Mueller, who wrote a 736-page book on the intellectual Cold Warriors, is the first person, as far as I know, to have engaged so extensively with the archival documentation regarding Marcuse's involvement that he's revealed things that we've never before known or have not been proven, such as, this is Mueller's quote, the research and analysis branch where Marcuse worked was the link between the other American intelligence services and the State Department, the military agencies, as well as the CIA. On behalf of the National Security Council, these intelligence agencies jointly produced the National Intelligence Estimates from 1950 onwards, the final editing of which was the responsibility of the CIA. Herbert Marcuse was also involved in this process, end quote, meaning he was directly involved in the drafting of national intelligence estimates, which are ultimately the final drafts of them are overseen by the CIA. So clearly, Marcuse, in his interview with Habermas, was being somewhat sly in his attempted self-exoneration. Now, there's a lot of other details that I'd like to go into, but I'm just going to highlight a few of the important elements. Marcuse had top secret security clearance. He was, according to Mueller, the leading authority in communism in the State Department in 1951. He served as the head of the Committee on World Communism, which reported directly to Alan Evans, who is the director of the Office of Intelligence Research. This office, the Office of Intelligence Research, in addition to being shared with the leadership of, the research developed by the OIR or the research that Marcuse was helping to develop, in addition to being shared with the leadership of the State Department and the policy planning staff, had as its main customers the President's National Security Council, the psychological warfare agencies, and the military, as well as the Central Intelligence Agency. Operations support for the CIA's Directorate of Plans was one of the tasks of this agency, the OIR, where Marcuse worked. It provided the Central Intelligence Agency with the knowledge it needed to carry out secret operations, local knowledge, for example, economic and biographical data, or information about organizations and political movements. So Marcuse, who is the head of this, the CWC it's called, which was within this research and analysis organization, was involved, like the other areas of state secret service in the planning of psychological warfare. Marcuse's organization amassed a treasure trove of information on the global communist movement, and, quote, the most important customer of this enormous knowledge storage and production site was demonstrably the CIA. As the chairman of the CWC, Marcuse, and later his pupil and fellow professor Bernard Morris, reported directly to the director of this research agency called the OIR, who is Alan Evans. Marcuse was thus only one administrative step away from Richard Bissell at the head of the CIA. Bissell, the Yale economics professor turned spy, embodied the dark side of the CIA and oversaw some of its most sordid covert operations, including the Bay of Pigs. So the OIR and Marcuse, insofar as he was the head of this specific organization called the CWC, were in permanent contact with the other side of the CIA anyway, meaning the side focused on research and analysis. So this gives you some sense of the extent to which Marcuse's involvement in the US national security state was much deeper than he led on to. I'll jump over a lot of the other details just to mention as well that Marcuse was then also a central figure in a very important project run by the Rockefeller Corporation. The Rockefellers, of course, were one of the leading robber barons in the history of US capitalism, and they, after Ford, had the second largest the second largest pool of funds that they used in soft power endeavors to have an influence over cultural and intellectual endeavors. And one of the things that they did is they set up a project called the Marxism-Leninism Project in 1960, and they allocated $165,000 to this project. That is the equivalent of $1.7 million in today's dollars. This project established an international research group, funded 9 global conferences, supported scholarly exchanges and research meetings, set up a research program in New York, supported dissertations, funded numerous publication projects, one of whose goals was to make purportedly authentic versions of Marxist texts available that had not been perverted by Moscow's influence. Marcuse was the central figure within the Rockefellers' Marxism-Leninism project. The central idea of this war on ideas undertaken by the Rockefeller robber barons was to wrest Marxism from the Soviets and to strengthen the socialists against the communists, which was both of these were in line with the kind of European specialists and their orientation, as well as the policy of the psychological warriors in the Central Intelligence Agency. So Marcuse was a key player at the center of all of these networks. He made a decisive contribution from the very beginning via a pilot project that he ran. And he was actually recruited and worked very closely with a close personal friend who regularly dined with his family, Philip Mosley. Philip Mosley is referred to as the Cold War's organization man because he managed many of these operations between the bourgeois state and the bourgeoisie. Both Marcuse and Mosley had been State Department operatives, and Mosley was the founder of the Russian Institute at Columbia University. He also worked, quote, as an advisor to the Central Intelligence Agency for many years with a clearance of the security level top secret. He also advised 2 Army think tanks, right? So you can hopefully see this complex web of relations. Again, there are more details that I could add, but just in the interest of time, I'll jump to a second example, and that is the work of Jacques Derrida. So as many people know who are familiar with Derrida's work, he was a kind of maestro of undecidability and celebrated aphoretic thinking and the inability to overcome contradictions as Marxists would through dialectical analysis by instead bearing endless witness to them. However, in the case of the Cold War, undecidability completely disappeared for Derrida. Derrida was never on the fence regarding what side he was on, nor did he seek to bring sophistication and nuance to the analysis of his class enemies. Quote, "We must have very definite political priorities," end quote. This is what Derrida said at a meeting at the Sorbonne in March 1980. This was a meeting convened to discuss the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, which Derrida would go on to become one of the president or co-president of the French chapter of this organization. The Jan Hus Educational Foundation brought together many conservatives and right-wing intellectuals, as well as artists who opposed communism, as well as anti-communist liberals like Derrida, social democrats, and Trotskyists. The relevant political distinction for the Jan Hus Educational Foundation was not right-left, as it operates within the imperialist core, but the much more fundamental polarization between so-called democracy and so-called totalitarianism. Derrida not only fully accepted this binary, but he also unquestioningly embraced the value hierarchy that positioned one side of the opposition above the other. As a matter of fact, this value-laden binary functioned as the transcendental horizon of his theoretical practice. While he was busy sniffing out the specters of Western metaphysics within the canon, he was squarely operating within the parameters of Western imperialism. So what the Jan Hus Educational Foundation did, and there are many other networks like this. In fact, we've been corresponding, a few of us been corresponding about the network around Praxis, Become Praxis International, Become Constellations, and that network resembles in many ways the networks of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, which was setting up a kind of international knowledge network by which the Eastern intelligentsia could be infiltrated by the Western intelligentsia in an effort to move the Eastern intelligentsia in the direction of the kind of compatible left forms of critical theory, if not, for that matter, further to the right, meaning either just straight up liberalism or conservatism or fascism. In the case of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, they mobilized press and media connections to bolster their cause, including Radio Oxford, the BBC, Radio Free Europe, and the Times, all of which had and continue to have very deep intelligence connections within the United Kingdom and more generally in the United States. They engaged in an expansive pro-Western cultural campaign in Czechoslovakia and Western Europe, which included specific programs for music, art, theater, literature, film, television, and religion. To, quote, plant the seeds of opposition in the communist countries, they established support networks for writers, scholars, musicians, and artists who were banned from presenting their work, end quote. All in all, the activities of the Jan Hus Educational Foundation resembled in content, form, and scope many of the other anti-communist campaigns run by imperialist powers and their national security states during the Cultural Cold War. The number of scholars involved is quite phenomenal. Charles Taylor, Roger Scruton, Tom Stopper, Donald Davidson, E.P. Thompson, Richard Rorty from the Anglophone sphere, Jürgen Habermas, Ernst Tugendhat from Germany. In France, we had Derrida, as I mentioned, but also Jean-François Lyotard, Jean-Luc Nancy, Étienne Balibar, Paul Ricoeur, André Glucksmann, many, many others. And so you see how expansive these networks were. And one of the things that's interesting is the leading intellectual figure behind the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, Roger Scruton, is on record after it was revealed that the Congress for Cultural Freedom was the CIA front organization. The Congress for Cultural Freedom was an organization set up to promote freedom and democracy among the intelligentsia and cultural producers, but it was discreetly funded and actually run directly by the CIA, and it was an enormous organization, so big that Hugh Wilford refers to it as the largest patron of arts and culture in the modern world, right? So it's an enormous, enormous organization. It was revealed that it was a CIA front. Roger Scruton came out later and he said that the CIA should return to funding these forms of cultural production, right? So his political orientation was clearly centered on that of what the CIA was doing. Now, the Jan Hus Educational Foundation, as far as I know, was never funded directly by the CIA, but in many ways it didn't have to be because it was instead funded by the National Endowment for Democracy. If people are familiar with the NED, it was established in 1983, and as Alan Weinstein, one of its founders, explained, a lot of what we do today, a lot of what the NED does today, was done covertly 25 years ago by the CIA. So the NED runs overt operations mirrored on the CIA's longstanding covert operations, and they're funded, like the Central Intelligence Agency, by the bourgeois state. The same organization that Derrida worked for, not simply intellectually, but he also smuggled in materials and ran underground seminars that were determined to be illegal within Czechoslovakia. In doing this, the same organization was also funded by the likes of the Margaret Thatcher Foundation, the Open Society Fund, the Ford Foundation, that works hand in glove with the CIA. In fact, works so intimately with the CIA that they have a permanent liaison between the CIA and Ford, the US Embassy in Prague, the United States Information Agency, etc. So hopefully you see how some of these networks operate. The last example that I'll turn to, and I'll try to be briefer on this so that we can open up for questions really soon, is in the third section. I look at the kind of radical theory industry of the contemporary world that comes out of these earlier traditions, because one of the constant questions that I've received concerning my scholarship is, okay, Rockhill, well, that was then, this is now, all of these nefarious organizations no longer exist or operate in the same way. Therefore, it seems that what you're describing is a historical fact, but nothing that could actually allow us to understand the contemporary world. I beg to differ and have done a lot of research in order to try to demonstrate why the fundamental systems of bourgeois knowledge production, funded by the capitalist ruling state, for the ruling class, overseen by the bourgeois state, continue to operate in much the same way. I'll just take one specific example, and it might be an example that people are familiar with. That is a famous conference in 1983 that took place in the United States at the University of Illinois, Urbana-Champaign. It was famous for at least two reasons. One is that it was claimed that Marxism was put back on the map, and the other is that it brought British-style cultural studies, in particular the work of Stuart Hall, to the United States. The figures who attended this conference include leading luminaries in Western Marxism, like Frederick Jameson, Perry Anderson, Gayatri Spivak, Stuart Hall, Cornel West, Chantal Mouffe, Ernesto Laclau, etc. It led to a publication, Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, which I'm sure many people are familiar with. I read it as an undergrad, and also a second anthology called Marxism and Cultural Studies that was published in 1990. According to many academics, these events and these publications signaled a revival of Marxism, which was able to overcome the crises that had plagued it through interlocking processes of diversification, hybridization, complexification, increased sophistication, etc. This begs the question, though, of the type of Marxism that was being championed and who was paying for it. As Grossberg and Nelson pointed out in their introduction to Marxism and the Interpretation of Culture, the work that they were promoting broke with purportedly old school Marxist accounts that reductively maintained, quote, that the dominant culture belonged to the dominant class and reflected both its interests and its interpretation of reality, end quote, right? So that's the old school view that is being called into question. They instead advocated, these are the editors of the first volume that came out of this conference that I mentioned, they advocated for an alternative tradition of Marxist cultural theorizing that drew on a non-Leninist interpretation of Gramsci, a Hegelianized version of Lukács, the work of Karl Korsch and Rosa Luxemburg and the Frankfurt School. The primary contemporary contributors, in addition to German-style critical theory, are French theory and British-style cultural studies. All three of these traditions extensively cross-pollinated in the US context, forming what is generally referred to as critical theory, or some people simply call theory. Timothy Brennan, I'll just rely on his account in order to sum this up quickly, went to the heart of matters. He wrote an excellent book review of this first volume that I'd recommend, because he identified the class configuration inherent within this volume of essays based on the conference. It is distinctly slanted against working class and revolutionary theorists in favor of intellectuals ensconced in imperial institutions. For all of its moral opining on not speaking in the place of the other, Spivak's famous essay was first published in this anthology. It does not provide the opportunity for a single Soviet scholar or some other representative of actually existing socialism to speak in their own name. The introduction of the book attempts to justify these class-based exclusions insofar as it is advocating for a more sophisticated Marxism, which is decentralized, self-critical, plural, and unpredictable. With a refreshing dose of precision, Brennan calls this position out for what it is, dogma. He then describes the entire project as one in which, quote, instinctively defensive middle-class intellectuals schooled in structuralism and semiotics swarmed in to tame the discourse of Marxism, and Brennan calls the book an essential case study in the commodification of theory. These events at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign are often celebrated, as I mentioned, as a kind of new sophisticated form of cultural Marxism. And a question arises regarding, well, who paid for all of this and how much did they invest? Unsurprisingly, it follows a pattern that I chart out in the earlier volumes of the book, meaning that the funders came from both capitalist ruling class and their bourgeois state managers. In this particular case, it was primarily the US state's National Endowment for Humanities that was bankrolling cultural anti-communist Marxism. The NEH allocated $26,000 to support this 5-week institute for 25 faculty. So they brought together faculty, and this was all around the conference. And then they allocated an additional $10,000 for follow-up work, which amounts to, in 2024 dollars, $114,000, right? For anyone involved in organizing an academic conference in which you have to scrape together a few $1,000s, imagine getting north of $100,000 for conferences, seminars, bringing faculty together, working on publications, etc. And this operation was seconded by the French Ministry of Culture, that actually chartered a plane in order to bring over French participants. Now, both of these activities on the part of the NEH and the French Ministry of Culture are part of a much broader portfolio, and I could go into the NEH's involvement in funding Western Marxism more generally and supporting anti-communist scholarship, the same on the side of the French Ministry of Culture. But in the interest of time, I think I'll wrap up there. Hopefully everybody sees the broader architecture, and then 3 examples that are just trying to flesh out this political economy of knowledge that pits forms of bourgeois knowledge production over and against the enemy of bourgeois knowledge production, which is a form of Marxism that is anti-revisionist and a form of Marxism that is invested in supporting the struggle to develop actually existing socialism, not supporting all forms of socialism, every manifestation thereof, critically engaging with the history of the socialist movement, of course, but not confining socialism to an idea in the minds of petty bourgeois intellectuals in the imperial core, but maintaining that it has to be and is already part of the real material reality of living people on planet Earth as they struggle to improve both their world and the broader environmental world of which they form a decisive part. So let's open up for questions, comments, criticisms, pushback. You can feel free to use maybe the raise hand function. I don't know if I'm going to be able to keep an eye on the chat quite as easily, so if you can weigh in verbally, that would be great. So the floor is open. We can also take a coffee break if people want to gather their thoughts. Oh no, everything's come together. Victor, go ahead, please.
Thank you for this absolutely fascinating presentation, some of which I knew from reading your earlier work, but there were new things here, and I'm extraordinarily impressed by it. I have an interesting anecdotal addition in a way, which is that in my effort when I first got out of college to find a Marxist to study with, I looked to Herbert Marcuse. I ended up not being able to study much with him, although I did go to the school where he was teaching at the time, which was Brandeis in the History of Ideas program. On that score, the one comment I would make is that the other Marxist, well, I don't know if you want to call Marcuse a Marxist under the circumstances, but the other significant person in my intellectual development who also worked for the OSS was Paul Sweezy, who represented an entirely different approach and for whom working in the OSS was part of the general sort of, you might say, united front against fascism. So there is that. I'm not in any way trying to exonerate Marcuse, though, and I think your revelations about him were quite fascinating. The one question that I would have in that connection has to do with the whole question of recovering Marx from the Soviet, let's say, treatment of him. And the most important manifestation of that I recall was the widespread diffusion of Marx's 1844 manuscripts, which, as they were saying at the time, had been sort of kept under wraps, had not been made prominent by the Soviet approach. So I guess it ties in with the larger question of to what extent there are some valid elements in the criticisms of the Soviet Union, even though it was largely weaponized, as you so well demonstrate, for the purposes of U.S. foreign policy.
A great question and comment, and quite fascinating. Maybe because I do see a lot of hands, maybe we'll just gather a few, and I'm taking notes. So Scott, do you want to join next?
Yes, thank you. Thanks so much for this. I really appreciate the little teaser that we have so far with your imperialist propaganda and ideology of the Western left intelligentsia paper, as well as and some of the new stuff that you shared today, which about Urbana-Champaign and other stuff that I had never heard before. My question has to do with the anti-democracy or the democratic illusions part of that paper. You rightly critique the American Revolution as anti-democratic and exclusionary. It's chauvinistic towards Native people, enslaved Africans and women, for example. However, other socialist writers like Carlos Garrido have lauded the American Revolution for breaking with British imperialism and for its potential to serve as a historical precedent for current socialist revolutionary projects in the empirical core. For example, Garrido, in a piece in the Journal of American Socialist Studies, references Lenin, Ho Chi Minh, Mao Zedong, Fidel Castro, praising the American Revolution as a model for other socialist experiments. Could you please speak to this, that even if it fails the democracy test, that there might be some potential for the American Revolution to function as an exemplar or as a precedent for future experiments? Thank you.
Great point. Catherine, maybe we'll take one more, and then I'll see if I can respond. They're great questions.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, my question is, as I got from your idea, you present like a model of like everybody's interface and backend. We have interface of public politicians and institutions, and backend of intellectuals who and not only intellectuals actually also an interface. And backend of plutocratic power structure. But in this model of like two components, there is also a third component. Let me borrow like from IT, like user expectations, user experience. I mean, when someone, when a young
Sorry,
person,
Catherine, could you, as much as possible, speak into the microphone, because it's a little difficult to hear some of what you're saying.
Yeah. Can you hear
I mean,
me
I heard the first part, but just the very last part.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, and the third component is expectations of a person who comes to this world of like this interface in backend, and these expectations, they're formed by discourse, and discourse mostly comes from, at least for young people, from popular culture, like movies, cinema, books, expectations of what is power and what questions it is, what questions you are supposed to ask. And probably this question, my question is more to Jennifer. How about what structure produces the way how young people perceive what politics is about, what power is about? And how, when, for example, when I watch old movies from beginning 20th century, they are more politicized in sense of speaking clearly what's power is about. When I watch Chinese movies, they openly discuss politics, conflicts between power structures. But when I watch Western movies, they generally present even so-called like politically rich movies. They present a very simplistic, idealistic picture of like evil corporation versus revolutionaries. So there is no space for any deeper question. I mean, in some sense, young people today, their understanding of politics is like maybe in 19th century, how young people perceived sexual life. It's something like good children never talk about. You should not ask questions. You should not ask what purpose. You should just stay away from this dirty politics and preferably also avoid like public politics. You should not merge yourself into asking deeper questions. So I'm curious to learn how these expectations, this discourse of innocence of youth in regards to politics, how and when it started to be formed into the state which we have now. Thank you.
Okay, great. Those are big and very rich questions. I'll try to do my best to respond to them succinctly so that we can get some more questions in. I'll just work through them chronologically, Victor. That's really interesting just historically, because I do think that Marcuse ended up playing a significant role that can't be reduced to occupying a single social position. So part of what I outline in the book is the difference between a kind of metaphysical or substantialist approach to the history of ideas and a dialectical or variegated approach. And according to variegated or dialectical hermeneutics, you have to kind of tease out the different dimensions that are operative within a body of work or within the life of an individual. And they can't just be summed up in terms of, you know, the sled rosebud, for instance, in Citizen Kane. The world is much more complex than that. And one of the powers of dialectical thinking is to try to apprehend that complexity at a higher level than you can if you simply approach the world in terms of simplistic categories or thinking at the level of what Hegel called the understanding. Now, if that sounds a little too philosophically abstract or methodologically kind of sophisticated for people who aren't familiar with either dialectics or these approaches, what that means more concretely is that in the case of Marcuse, I do insist on the fact that he underwent a radicalization, clearly. He was radicalized mainly by the student movement, the Black liberation movement in the US, and to a certain extent, the kind of third world liberation struggles. His radicalization did not make him into a communist. He remained a stalwart anti-communist till the end of his life, but he opened up to forms of kind of radical insurgency and ultimately positions that flirt with a third way kind of ultra leftist politics. And I certainly remember when I read Essay on Liberation, for instance, his most radical text, arguably, when I was an undergraduate, I thought, oh yeah, finally, I'm finding something radical. And there's a big difference between that text and earlier texts like Soviet Marxism or One Dimensional Man. So a variegated analysis allows us to account for that. Sweezy, of course, was in the OSS, but he was also suspected on the part of the US national security state of being a communist. And so he occupied a slightly different position. And you're absolutely right that part of what Western Marxism has attempted to do, and Marcuse was at the absolute core of this project, was to develop an account of authentic Marxism, right, that hadn't been perverted by the Soviets, which basically means it hadn't been perverted by the people who put socialism into practice. And part of that was a cultivation of an interest in the early Marx, the humanist Marx, who is supposedly closer to, and ultimately you see this where this is coming from in Marcuse, to a more kind of subjectivist understanding, where, you know, Marcuse, who had studied with Heidegger, is coming more out of an existential phenomenological orientation. And there's a clear thread of subjectivism throughout Marcuse's work that keeps him from doing a full-blown objectivist analysis a la a Marxist analysis. So I guess that's what I tell. Oh, and then finally, because the core of your point was on the way in which the Soviet Union formatted particular apprehensions of Marxism, you know, Marxism, I think the best way of understanding Marxism is not even by using the term, quite honestly, It's dialectical and historical materialism is a collectively articulated science that's not a science in a positivistic, objectivist sense of the term. It's that we're trying to understand the world to be able to change it, but that within that science, struggles continue to go on. And if there's agreement about certain fundamentals, there's many quite fundamental disagreements within that, just as there is within any other science. And so I think in relationship to Soviet-style Marxism, some of the developments, for instance, in Latin American Marxism or Chinese Marxism for that matter, have been critical of certain orientations, but within the general understanding that the point of Marxism isn't to get Marx right or to be authentically attuned to certain forms of Marxist thinking, like getting back in touch with his mind or something like that, but instead that what proves Marxist orientation to be better or worse than another is practice and what actually works in the real world. Concerning Scott's point on the US-American War of Secession, I'd say a few things. And again, I would marshal a dialectical analysis. So what happened at that point in time was a complex phenomenon. I don't think it makes sense to understand it as a social revolution. A social revolution reconfigures the social fabric, like the Haitian Revolution, the French Revolution. And the US-American Revolution didn't do that. It consolidated the US-American ruling class's control over the working class and the slaves, the slaughtered indigenous population. Women weren't enfranchised or given any power whatsoever. So it maintained the fundamental capitalist colonial structures of empire. It just put as the new rulers of those, the US-based ruling class as opposed to the British ruling class. Within that, though, and this leads to the question of, well, why are there certain revolutionaries who have celebrated elements of the US-American so-called revolution? Again, it's not really a revolution, it's more of a war of secession. Is if you undertake a variegated and dialectical analysis, then you can pinpoint certain elements within that time period of the end of the 18th century and say, well, yes, this seems like a worthy cause. So Ho Chi Minh cited the Declaration of Independence, saying, well, all men are created free and equal. Well, Vietnamese men too, like we're on board with this project. And so many of the communists recognize in the history of bourgeois thought and political practice that there are valid principles. But the problem is that the principles need to be universalized, and they actually aren't under political liberalism. There's a fundamental point that Domenico Losurdo makes again and again. The point is not to abolish the kind of universal rights of human beings. The point is to actually universalize them for the first time in history. The other reason, of course, that Ho Chi Minh did this in relationship, just to take this example, is because he was trying to get the US imperialists not to invade him. And so there's also a tactical element regarding why certain communists have they've wanted to tease out the kind of revolutionary tradition within the US. The celebration, though, of the US-American Revolution as this American Revolution that we should embrace. I saw somebody put in the chat a reference to MAGA communism, which I reject absolutely, completely, and with no hesitation whatsoever, because I see it being problematic at every possible level, and I'd be happy to talk about that if people want to. I don't think that it really makes sense to just recuperate certain moments and then to celebrate the US-American Revolution without actually unpacking the very specific class dynamics that were operative therein, and the fact that this was part of an intensified class warfare against the overwhelming majority of the US population at that point in time. And so I don't see it as principally liberatory. I see it as maybe some liberatory sparks. And actually, if you descend down to a more fine-grained analysis, which I have not seen Carlos Garrido do, but maybe he does at some point in time, I just haven't seen it, is that people like Thomas Paine, for instance, did take positions that were quite radically democratic in relationship to the Federalists, who wanted to shore up a form of US government that was anti-democratic through and through. And he and others who were the more radical fringe called out the Federalists and said that, well, what they're setting up is an aristocratic empire. And they were obviously right about that. So depending on who you look at and where the play of forces is, there might be certain elements that we could pinpoint. Catherine, regarding your point, and sorry to go on a little bit at length, but they're really rich and deep questions. So if I understood you correctly, my framing of this would be the following, that it's not necessarily the case that the way in which the bourgeois state operates is that it does have a political legal apparatus, but the bourgeois state is also crucially, unbelievably involved in cultural production, circulation, and consumption, right? The NEH funding would just be one example among many others, or the fact that based on internal documents, we now know that so many of the major Hollywood films that are made, particularly those concerning US foreign policy, are actually basically products of the Pentagon, because the Pentagon has full censorship rights over everything. They're allowed to see the film before it's actually released to the public, etc. So it's not as if there's the private sector of cultural production and then the bourgeois state over here. That's liberal ideology that separates the kind of public from the private. These work very much hand in glove. And one of the reasons that they try to disarticulate themselves is to make it appear as if there's a realm of private enterprise that functions autonomously from the involvement of the bourgeois state. And regarding why young people in particular are politically indoctrinated in particular ways, I think a very big part of that story is what I would refer to, following the work of Bertolt Brecht, the cultural apparatus. The cultural apparatus is that part of the superstructure that produces, disseminates, and has consumed culture in the broadest sense of the term. And I think you're absolutely right that the primary way in which young people tend to be politicized isn't through direct political education. It's usually through online culture, TV, movies, social media, and things like this. And those are all platforms that are owned and controlled by the capitalist ruling class, or at least the main ones that are in use within the imperial core. And they have exercised an unbelievable power over what gets to be distributed, who has access to it, and what gets either shadow banned or simply excluded. And so understanding how the bourgeois cultural apparatus functions and how the US as the leading imperial power in the world it's a veritable empire of ideas. It produces people's mindscapes and plugs them in to a powerful source that really hijacks autonomous thinking on the part of most subjects, because it functions not unlike in IV, where you begin to learn politically about the world from all of the culture that you're exposed to prior to being able to develop yourself as a politically self-conscious being. And that's part of the point, of course. The last thing that I'd say is there's a great line, I can't remember who said it, but it's someone in the Central Intelligence Agency who said that the greatest way to contribute to propaganda is to make sure people don't know that it's propaganda. And the principal way of doing that is by entertaining them, meaning entertainment as the sugar-coated pill of propaganda. So let's open up for another round of questions. I think, Michelle, you have your hand.
Can you guys hear me? I think my microphone isn't working very well, is it? It is? Okay, great. So my question is a little similar to Victor's. I have this, this preoccupation on how we can differentiate real and important critics to existent socialism, you know, like to critics to what happened in Soviet Union or Stalin actions, or most recently China's approach to socialism, you know, because they are all social and political phenomena. They have issues and flaws and misinterpretations of reality. You know, differentiate as critics, serious critics, from anti-communist and imperial critics that actually meant to destroy socialism, you know, because within all those actors you mentioned, some were clearly opportunistic. You probably get this question a lot, but you know, some were clearly collaborating with the bourgeois class, but some of these authors were less so, I guess. Some were just wrong or mistaken, or you know, how can we find out which critics is serious before the destructive effects? You know, I'm thinking of Roger Kiram. He has a book about the betrayal of Soviet Union, and one of the problems he mentions is that the Communist Party in Soviet Union wasn't able to differentiate serious critics to the system to opportunistic critics. You know, this was one of the causes of the weakness or demoralization of the party that led to the collapse of the Soviet Union, you know, between many other problems. So I think being able to differentiate serious critics that lead to the improvement of social movements and socialism from critics that is just, you know, epistemologically focused and infertile and leads to destruction before, you know, the destruction happens, is of central importance. And, you know, maybe because I'm new at this, for me, it's very difficult to differentiate which critics is which. So my question is a little bit about that.
Great question. Markella?
Yeah, thanks so much, Gabriel. It's really amazing work. I've got two questions, if I may. I'm wondering how you'd place Mark Fisher within your theory, you know, with his famous capitalist realism and the idea that it's easier to imagine an end to the world than an end to capitalism, which has quite a, you know, the phrase has been quite deleterious. It's not his phrase, and he was critiquing it, but nevertheless, it's been very powerful as a way of sort of allowing people to critique, but not go beyond that. That's one question. The other question is, you know, what you've laid out is it's reminiscent of Marx's invisible threads, and I'm wondering if you thought about doing like a silly data visualization of all these connections and all these networks. I think that could be quite helpful for all of us to really understand the pervasiveness of what you're talking about. Thank you.
Great. Maybe we'll take one more. Colin?
Hey, so I think you answered part of this already, because I was going to ask about Marcuse's relationship with like the student movements in the 60s. But more specifically about his relationship with Angela Davis, because she's also been criticized recently for kind of covering over the role of certain intelligence agencies with people involved in the Black liberation struggle and stuff like that. But where you see his like influence fitting in both on the Black liberation movement and then on the 60s radicals themselves, was this kind of organic because Marcuse was a well-known figure and they picked up these books and started using them, or was there like something more going on here?
Okay, another great round of questions. Regarding Michelle's point, I'd say a few things. First is that there is an entire industry of the false critics of actually existing socialism or Marxism in general. And a big part of the series of books focuses, not a big part, but some of it touches on this. So Sovietology, as we understand it in the Imperial core, is almost completely an intelligence product. So the leading figures in both British, US American, and there are other examples from other countries, these experts on the Soviet Union, for instance, Robert Conquest comes to mind. He worked for the Information Research Department, which was run by MI6, the United Kingdom's intelligence service, and actually integrated elements from the propaganda files into his quote unquote scholarship. So there's a long, deep, and dark history of academic whitewashing of bourgeois propaganda. It's the material that I read when I got interested in the Soviet Union. It's also the material, by the way, that when most of the French theorists and Frankfurt School theorists and contemporary radical theorists, they say, oh, we're against socialism, someone like Badiou will reference these books that are, you know, unbeknownst to himself, I assume, they're pure and absolute propaganda. Now, it doesn't mean that within propaganda, you have to take some real facts and then frame them in such a way that they're made incoherent. But that's important to be attentive to. That being said, of course, there are real critics, and the best critics, I think, are those, again, I'll give a shout out to Domenico Losordo. He referred to the tradition of critical communism. And what's important about critical communism is that you share a common goal. The goal is not to be right in the sense of having the best theoretical account or proving somebody wrong. The goal is to maximize the impact of the working masses on the transformation of the world in the direction of socialism. And so there needs to be a kind of primacy of practice that is the foundational, I think, element within critical communism. But that critical communism needs to learn from its mistakes and develop itself over time. And so I think one of the richest things about actually existing socialism is precisely that. You brought up the case of China. China studied and followed very, very closely everything that happened in the Soviet Union, and they made explicit decisions based on what they judged to be the missteps of the Soviet Union. Those missteps weren't because they were theoretically wrong in some like abstract intellectual sense. It's because they did things that practically didn't work, and therefore they needed to try something else out. Because socialism, we shouldn't forget, is trying to do the impossible, which is bring about a new socioeconomic system in a world that rejects that, and it's charting uncharted territory, hence the absolute centrality of the primacy of practice. So, we could take different examples of where, because then we'd have to get into the details, like where do we agree with certain communist critiques and where do we find them incorrect? I'll just give you one example. It took me a long time before I accepted this position, but now I think it's the correct position. Domenico Losordo, many others have said that the reform and opening up that happened in the 70s in China was not forsaking socialism for a capitalist path. It was instead overcoming the Marxist-Leninist fetishization of poverty and misery as equivalent to being communism. And that what was required was the development of the productive forces so that you could have shared prosperity. In order to do that, you enter into a whole series of very enormous, complicated contradictions. Exploitation continues or even gets worse. There's socioeconomic polarization, there's ecological degradation, etc. But if you're thinking in the long term, the goal is to develop the productive forces so that your society can operate at a higher level, and you can then undertake, and hopefully this is also something that's accompanied the whole project, greater forms of common prosperity. And when you look at the Chinese poverty alleviation program, 850 million people, the greatest poverty alleviation program in the history of humanity, that's more than the entire population of Latin America, just to put it in perspective. That is an awesome feat that I think everyone needs to recognize as just truly incredible without, negating other certain criticisms. So that would be one example where I think that the Chinese decided, okay, just confronting the imperial powers head on, getting into an arms race, fighting them endlessly, this is going to wear us down. It's going to lead to internal divisions, internal destabilization. What if instead we pivoted and found a way of letting in certain elements of international capitalism, but controlling the state, controlling the banking sector, controlling the towering heights of the economy, in order to work with the enemy, but not give the enemy power over our nation state, so that we can, most importantly, develop the productive forces, get technological transfer from the West, which is absolutely essential to this whole process, and hopefully catapult ourselves into the future. Looking years later after the Deng years, you would say, well, now it is the biggest economy in the world according to purchasing power parity, and is going to soon surpass the US in just general terms. There's something that is succeeding in the Chinese model. And again, just to be crystal clear, I'm not saying everything's perfect in China. It is a utopian model, etc. But as inspired by Losordo and many, many others, I would recommend Carlos Martinez's work on this. There's lots of other good people. I think that's one of the important perspectives. The last thing that I would say is that it's important to distinguish between the nature of theoretical practices. And real Marxists are invested in a theoretical practice that is collective. It's focused on developing knowledge that can be shared, and it's oriented towards improving the material world and material reality. That's the mere opposite of the dominant form of theoretical practice within the Imperial Academy, which is about individual promotion of a brand, a specific conceptual vocabulary, a unique view that no one has, a market share that nobody can encroach on, etc. And so if you look at Bedousian, Negri, Hart, all of these people, what they're doing is brand management. They're not contributing to a collective project of intellectual elucidation aimed at transforming the world. They're principally oriented towards increasing their market share as self-proclaimed radicals within the imperial theory industry. And so their criticisms I do not take seriously at all, because they're not actually contributing to a collective process of intellectual and practical elucidation. Markella's questions, and again, I almost feel like I'm going too long and too short at the same time, because we could talk about these for a long time, but just in the interest of getting to the other questions, Markella, I do think that Mark Fisher's position on capitalist realism is just a manifestation of dogmatic ideology within the Western left. If you look at the actually existing history of socialism, not that told by the propagandists of Sovietology, socialism between 1917 and at least the end of the 1970s was continuing to make significant advances against the imperialist stranglehold. It was growing. At its high point, 2/5 of the world's population was living under countries that were self-declared socialist. So what does that mean? What it means to me is Mark Fisher's living in an imperialist bubble in which he, like many other like-minded people in the world, assumed that he can't imagine reality. And reality is that actually existing socialism has existed, continues to exist, and continues to eke out a life that is partially distinct from the dominant life within the imperial core, and that if it could expand more, would become more and more distinct. The visualization idea is absolutely brilliant. And I would love to be able to work with someone who has the artistic and technical knowledge to be able to do that, because it's true that when you map everything out and you start to see it, you can apprehend the whole system. And you move from particular ideological manifestations to the whole system that produces those ideological manifestations. So the systemic view is crucial. If anyone has any ideas, I'm a taker, reach out to me. Colin, on Marcuse, it's interesting because on the one hand, his research was funded by the Rockefellers. He was hired at Ivy League institutions because he was a State Department operative who was funded by the capitalist ruling class, right? So talk about a jumpstart to one's academic career. That's what made Marcuse. At the same time, it is true that a book like One Dimensional Man sold, I believe, 200,000 copies, right? Were there other forces behind this? It's very possible. I haven't seen any proof of it. But the original pilot project that One Dimensional Man came out of was funded by the Rockefellers, right? So it comes out of that same basic complex, if you will. And so there is one sense in which Marcuse did become a figure because of the forces behind him. Moreover, and I think this is very important, it's something that I'm currently exploring and haven't yet gotten to the bottom of, it is incredible how much bourgeois press Herbert Marcuse received. And it's also unbelievable how much bourgeois press people like Zizek, Badiou, Judith Butler, and others receive today. If you know the history of the bourgeois press, these are not forces that act independently of the bourgeois government. They work very closely, when necessary, with the US national security state or other intelligence agencies abroad, for that matter, depending on what we're talking about. And so it begs the question, when you have the radical movements of the 1960s and early 1970s, these are complex movements, right? Some of them are Marxist-Leninists, some of them are, radical anarchists. There's many, many different versions of this that come together. I know from internal documents, the US national security state was very, very concerned about the New Left, and they followed them closely. They unleashed COINTELPRO in order to crush and eliminate any organization in the New Left. If it was women's organizations, Black organizations, anti-war organizations, didn't matter. They wanted to crush them. At the same time, organizations that were more focused on the International World War, like the Central Intelligence Agency, which exercises a lot more control over the media, had a vested interest in controlled counter-hegemony. Controlled counter-hegemony is when you have a force that appears counter-hegemonic, but you control it in various ways. So the fact that the bourgeois press published, was just this morning counting the number of articles published by New York Times, Newsweek, et cetera, saying how important Herbert Marcuse was. When they promote him to that extent, and this is an anti-communist who at best is a kind of insurgent anarchist. He's on record saying that Marxism should be injected with a strong dose of anarchism. Anarchism being the political philosophy, of course, that Lenin referred to as suffering from an infantile disorder. And we could go into why that is the case, but I think it's a correct diagnosis. So is there, on the part of the US ruling class and its bourgeois state, an attempt to promote Marcuse as the godfather of the New Left as a way of controlling the counter-hegemonic forces at that point in time? It's very possible. I do know that he was sent to France in 1968 by no other than the Rockefeller Foundation, who funded his entire stay as a visiting professor at an organization and an institution that itself was part of the Rockefellers' Marxist-Leninist institutional complex within Europe to promote non-communist forms of Marxism. And his mission was very explicitly to try to convert the French intelligentsia from a more hardline anti-revisionist Marxism to a Western Marxism. And part of what happened there was he was radicalized by some of the French intelligentsia whom he met. He was obviously also radicalized by Angela Davis. Last thing that I'll say is regarding Angela Davis's own trajectory, of course, early on, she was very close to the Panthers, very supportive of, corresponding with George Jackson in prison, obviously important member of the CPUSA, played a very important role. Also, her research, especially the early work, is really top-notch on the history of the women's movement, the radical Black liberation movement, and things like this. She did also, though, have her own trajectory, and her trajectory is very much in the direction of a slightly more reformist, social democratic orientation. And what you're alluding to, and I think that Joy James has done good work on this, even though Joy James doesn't really frame her work within a anti-revisionist Marxist understanding, that she's pointed out that Angela Davis has had somewhat of a role in airbrushing the revolution and in sidelining really important questions regarding the infiltration of the Black Panthers, in particular the role of Elaine Brown, who is suspected by many as being an FBI informant who orchestrated the split between the East Coast Panthers and the West Coast Panthers, and also helped facilitate the downfall of Huey Newton by making drugs easily accessible to him. There seems like a lot of evidence that supports those claims, but I haven't mined down as deep as one could into it. And I think they're significant. They're complex histories. So I guess I'll leave it at that, and maybe we'll go to a new round with Francesca. I believe you're up first.
Hi, thank you so much for all of this work. A lot of what you've said about Marcuse, you've answered for me. I suppose it's a little bit of a two-pronged question. The first being the extent to which you situate this larger discourse or unbelievable research into these sort of covert activities by intellectuals like Marcuse during the period of this early period within, I guess, a discourse on their identities, their experiences as Jewish exiles fleeing the Nazi regime. And I guess more broadly speaking, at the end of the 40s and throughout the 50s, the extent to which there is this broader, very outspoken pressure against anyone who, sort of even has a whisper of communism within the larger sort of political spectrum, with the rise of McCarthyism, et cetera, the ways in which that may have inflected some of these activities by these intellectuals. And then I guess secondarily, when it comes more specifically to Marcuse, I think about the fact that in 1976, then Governor Ronald Reagan conspires with the regents of the University of California system to impose an arbitrary, retirement age in order to oust Marcuse, that the KKK made death threats against him, that the American Legion tried to buy out his contract. And then again, to go back to Angela Davis, that she sort of cites him as instrumental in giving her the tools towards a more radicalized outlook to the world. That's not to say I'm very grateful to hear about all of the research you've done, and it's so necessary to complicate one's perspective on someone that you work on extensively. So thank you.
Can you just I want to make sure understand the first part of your question. Could you just formulate it as a question so I make sure I get it?
Yes, sorry. I suppose one, how the sort of lived experience as German Jewish exiles may have inflected the decisions that these theorists had in working with the United States government, and subsequently how that continued affiliation or work and their sort of larger public posturing is inflected by the discourse of anti-communism within the larger social political sphere of late 1940s, 1950s America. You know, I think like in Eros and Civilization, Marcuse never actually uses the name Marx. So.
Okay, great. Beltran?
Hi, yeah. So I was wondering if you've thought of or considered researching and writing about the sort of third world reception of compatible left theory. So thinking specifically about sort of post-colonial theorists like Edward Said, Spivak, but perhaps more specifically, this like more contemporary current of decolonial studies. I mean, it's kind of a mixed bag, and so they're all really different. But I guess in general, there seems to be, at least the way I see it, a tendency to consider Marx a Eurocentric thinker and try to recover these sort of more indigenous forms of knowledge production, which in itself is not necessarily a bad thing. The only issue is they're appealing to Foucault and to Adorno in order to do it, right? So yeah, I don't know. My question is, have you looked at that? Is that something you've considered? Maybe a fourth volume on third world receptions? No.
I'm going to cut it off
Okay.
at the fourth, but great question. Joao?
Hi. First of all, thank you, Gabriel, a lot. I'm really excited about this project. I'm eager to read it. And from the articles I read and the talks you gave, I think it's really important. After I read the Francis Stoner Sanders, The Cultural Cold War, for me, there was no doubt at this material level of how deep the Western Marxism and the so-called left are entrenched with capital. I already knew from methodological standpoint that you see this road of feminine wars and all the problems that exist, and all came the major theorists always talking about frivolous things, or the most, like I said yesterday, about inequality distribution, but never at the property level, for instance. And when I see nowadays not only academia but also journalists, you see a lot of journalists that consider themselves independent journalists, but I think journalists in general lack a lot of theoretical grounding. And so my question is not about your critique on this, but how can we take work such as these or your upcoming books and try to frame in a way that to get more popularized the ideas, these notions, so they get to be more known, instead of hearing something like cultural Marxism, as if Marx was cultural Marxism, which cultural Marxism as a term come from cultural Bolshevism, from the Nazis and so forth and so on. So how can we break, and maybe if you have time to talk about the MAGA communism, because I think the very idea of MAGA is completely absurd in itself, but that I think talks a lot about this problem of methodology, of infiltration, fifth column, and all these aspects. So I don't know, that could be an example and help people fight and diagnose the problems in a concrete way.
Another great set of questions and comments. Regarding Francesca's, first and foremost, you're absolutely right that, of course, the specific context of Cold War US and McCarthyism, as well as the rise of Nazism, had an enormous impact on all of the kind of first generation of the Frankfurt School, and that part of their dedication within the US national security state was to the struggle against fascism, because that's how the war was framed, at least from a certain point in time within the US context. In the wake of the war, many of them justified then their time in the US national security state saying, hey, we're fighting Nazis. We don't have any, you can't cast shade over that. I should note, moreover, and I highlight this in the book, it's a fascinating element that I discovered. There is some documentary evidence to suggest that Franz Neumann, who was Herbert Marcuse's best friend, in fact, they were so close that Herbert Marcuse married Neumann's widow after Neumann died. And all three of them had lived together for a short amount of time prior to that point in time. Franz Neumann was apparently a double agent working for the Soviets. And so these are quite complex histories. And there is some archival suggestion that the Soviets were considering contacting Marcuse, but there's no evidence that they actually did that. Again, I don't want to kind of overstate the case, but because I try to be very precise in what I say in the book, but I thought that I would mention that. Regarding the others, though, within that context, it is the idea that they were just intellectuals fighting fascism is kind of thin, because the US wasn't invested in fighting fascism. It had rejected all of the pleas on the part of Stalin to form an alliance against fascism. They didn't take a position in the Spanish Civil War, which was the precursor to the Second World War and basically a fight between fascists and communists. And there's many, many signs. And then they dragged their feet for 2 years before opening the Western Front, because they wanted to bleed the Soviet Union. And Truman's on record saying, well, we'll enter the war, based on, we'll wait and see who's winning and who's losing. So it was a very opportunist entrance into the war. And then the US national security state, the OSS, the more action arm, whereas Marcuse and his friends were in the research arm, they were corresponding with the Nazis, particularly in Switzerland, and they were working on a plan to have the Nazis actually sign a peace agreement with the West so they could unleash the full force of the Nazi war machine against the East. And moreover, in the immediate wake and already starting during World War II, the US national security state recuperated an enormous number of Nazis and fascists into their international project of advancing imperialism. So the idea that they were fighting fascism when they're working for the US government is really pushing the imagination too far for my taste. And I just add to that the US was a racial apartheid state at that point in time, and it was involved in international empire building, right? So I think it's a kind of mixed bag. That said, Marcuse and his friends did make recommendations regarding the denazification of Germany that I think were significant, because they said we should go off after business leaders and do some other things. Those are important suggestions. They weren't followed, but they were significant suggestions. And you're absolutely right. I'm glad that you highlighted it. I pointed out in the book as well. So Marcuse is interesting as well because he reveals some of the contradictions operative within intellectual production. Here he is, a State Department operative for 10 years, working for the Rockefellers on this Marxist-Leninist project to shore up Western Marxism. But then he gets radicalized, becomes a major figure in the New Left. And I've read his FBI file. It's very long, very detailed. They knew every step that he was taking. They had informants in airports. They had his entire itineraries when he was traveling. And so they're following him because they considered him to be a threat. And as well, the other issues that he highlighted, he was basically fired, right? He was squeezed out of his position at the University of California. And so someone like Marcuse can, at one and the same time, be perceived as a threat by certain elements within the US national security state, while also being perceived as a useful enemy by other elements of the US national security state. And there are plenty of other cases of this, right? The people who run these operations are usually Ivy League trained, and they're very intelligent people, and they know that we can't just fight our enemies. Sometimes we have to use them in rather creative ways. Beltran's question, yes, actually, there's not going to be a fourth volume. I have to cut this off in the sense that the research that goes into this has taken literally decades, and I'm interested in the social totality, not just the radical theory industry within the imperial core. And so I have a longstanding book project on fascism, a book project that I've been working on with Jennifer on art and culture, and I want to be able to get back to those. But in the third volume, there is at least one long section, there might be others, that deal with what you're alluding to. And that is that one of the things that the US empire has done is that it has not simply, it kind of used the French and German cultural history, because bourgeois society was much more developed within Western Europe. And so Western Europe had a lot more cultural cred, and it still does to some extent, right? When you see the amount of Eurocentrism in the cultural world, when you hear that an intellectual knows something about France or Germany, this is often more sophisticated than knowing something about Zimbabwe, for instance. And so the early forms of compatible critical theory were largely Western European, and then some of them integrated, elements from the US or from Great Britain. But the more recent manifestations of them are a consequence of the history of US imperialism. And that is that it's very helpful to have people who look like the targets of imperialism who are working in your intelligentsia, because then it doesn't look like you're undertaking imperialism. And so the recruitment of third world intellectuals who are doing compatible critical theory and who then become dons in the imperial core and oversee basically what are international franchises is extremely important. A good example of this is the work of Walter Mignolo, for instance, right, who is able to vet so much of the theory produced in the global south, in particular in Latin America, and decide what is worthy of being translated, who's worthy of being invited to Ivy League schools in the north, who's worthy of being cited, and who is not. And that power, Silvia Rivera Kizikanki, who's more anarchist than Marxist, but has an excellent interview where she talks about how decolonial theory itself is a colonial project. It's a colonial project because it is about shoring up the power networks of the imperial core over and against knowledge production in the global south and using it basically for the same ends. It's just a little bit more confusing because of the color of people's skins, their ethnicities, their cultural backgrounds, etc. And there are many other examples of that. Spivak, of course, studied under Paul de Man and cut her teeth translating Jacques Derrida. Paul de Man, if you're not familiar with the story, it was revealed was not only a Nazi collaborator, but worked so deeply with the Nazi collaborationist publication industry in Belgium that he was expecting to be appointed a minister of culture within the European Reich. This is Spivak's pedigree, right? And she learned about Derrida via de Man and then ended up translating him, and has taken positions, I think they're very important, class critiques of Spivak and of Said for that matter. If people are familiar with the work of Ajaz Ahmad, I'd highly recommend it. The other thing I guess that I'd say is that I couldn't agree more with your characterization of a lot of this theory. In order for it to have credibility within the imperial theory industry, it can't go totally off the tracks, right? So think about it for a moment. Spivak is basically a Derridian. Said is principally a Foucaultian. Someone like Mignolo is more or less, Foucaultian, but also drawing on a few other sources. Someone like Enrique Dussel is a Levinasian. Of course, they have other influences, but they all speak the lingua franca of the reliable and guaranteed reference points of the imperial theory industry. What they then try to do is combine it with some type of local knowledge, but they're not actually combining it with local collective knowledge that is different from what is produced within the empire. They are using imperial modes of intellectual production in order to siphon off third world intellectual production and encase it within forms of compatible critical theory. So I see them fully marching in lockstep with this exact same tradition. And I would say the same for Afro-pessimism. I would say the same for kind of liberal queer theory, liberal versions of feminism. There are other versions that one could point to, but the kind of trend-setting discourses of the empire all follow the same basic pattern. And when you think about it systemically, as opposed to individually, it makes perfect sense. Would the US empire, right, which has killed intellectuals around the world, right? Hunted down and killed Ernesto Che Guevara. Are they going to empower, enfranchise, promote revolutionary theorists from the global South? Or are they going to try to find a highly commodifiable, marketable version that they can use in order to advance their agenda of shoring up in a revisionist, anti-communist form of Marxism or radical theory? Well, they're going to do the latter, and they keep doing it constantly. So we should get attuned to the fact that there's a systemic process here and be able to analyze that so we don't get lost in all of the details. Joelle, you raised a really important question. I guess I would say two things. One is that concerning the so-called MAGA communist movement, it's not really a movement. These are online influencers who are trying to develop forms of monetization for their particular products. It's not a political party. It's not a social movement. It is concocted out of a series of online influencers, many of whom have very suspect histories and pasts, and who are promoted in various ways by very nefarious forces. This could be, Donald Trump retweeting Jackson Hinkle. It could be the fact that there's an incredible amount of bourgeois press coverage right now of supposed communists in the United States who aren't really communists, in my opinion. They're influencers who are trying to build a platform. And Hinkle, who's really I think, most visible of all of them, is a self-proclaimed opportunist. He said it again and again. Everything I do is for clout. Everything I do is for clout. He used to be a Bernie bro. Now all of a sudden he's a communist, but a communist who supports the oil and gas industries. And there's all these contradictions that are operative in his position and the position of others who identify with MAGA communism. And that's largely due to the fact that opportunism is driving it, not a real political project. And the last thing that I'd say just on that front is that there's a political economy of digital intellectual production that explains an enormous amount regarding what's going on around MAGA communism and those who are tailing MAGA communism. If you want to make your living through online culture, it's called, there's a term for it, algorithmic hijacking, where you use the hashtag MAGA, you engage with this extreme right-wing debate, you're going to have a lot bigger following for two reasons. One is that there are organic elements. The other is because the people who own and control the digital means of communication have a vested interest in promoting this type of work, meaning right-wing fascist types of orientations. And so algorithmic hijacking allows certain influencers to expand their platform, and by expanding their platform, they expand their revenue base. And that, I think, is the principal thing driving MAGA communism, meaning opportunism, not a real project to rejuvenate something like a vital communist movement within the United States. And I should add to that the positions that they've taken, the homophobic positions, the transphobic positions, the just kind of, I think, pig-headed rejections of what they call wokeism, but what they throw out with all of that is a lot of the struggle against racism, misogyny, homophobia, etc. These positions no principled Marxist would ever support, and I would certainly not. The popularization of some of these positions, it begs the question, given what I just outlined. The most popular positions on the platforms that we currently have, sorry, there's an incoming call, are going to be those positions that feed to the system and that get uplift from the system. So I think we have to do a lot of things, right? We have to be able to work collectively. We have to be able to develop alternative platforms and hopefully exercise as much control as possible over those platforms. And we also have to find ways of translating discourses like the one I just shared with you, which admittedly is very highfalutin, complex, and sophisticated. People who don't know Marcuse or the various histories that we're talking about will not understand them. And so we have to be able to politically educate at many different levels, including the levels of political education that are just popular education, right? That can translate everything that I just said into terms that are readily accessible, and that and we need platforms, more platforms. There are some, many of which I've collaborated with, that do that, but we need more platforms in order to be able to do that at a broader and deeper level. I think there's one more question, at least Vishnu. I think you'll have the last word because we're getting close to the end.
Thanks. I echo what everyone said about the meticulousness of your work. Thank you for that. My question is kind of a compliment to Beltran's. We've discussed it over email a little bit, but to ask it in a more generalized way, instead of third world reception of these Western Marxists or cultural Marxists, do you deal at all with the second world reception or second world critique of them? And I mean, on one level, I can imagine that there might not be so much because they just weren't taken seriously within actually existing socialist countries. But there are a few instances of, at least I know about Soviets, and I don't know so much about Chinese, but scholars dealing with and even debunking, if you like, some of these works in real time. I mean, at the time that they were coming out. So I'm curious if this at all factors into your work, or if it doesn't, if you think that it's worth looking at.
Great question. I don't have a kind of developed account thereof, mainly because there is an enormous body of literature. If it could be the Soviets, the Chinese, the Cubans, etc. But I certainly touch on it at numerous times in passing because I think it fleshes out the kind of larger system. I'll just give you one example in the interest of wrapping up. Yuri Zhukov in the Soviet Union wrote an important article in Pravda in which he described Marcuse as a counter-revolutionary who is attempting to undertake a decommunization of Marxism, to divide and bring internal quarreling to progressive forces, and thus carry out the quite explicit social imperatives of the enemies of the working movement, right? And he kind of doubled down on this and went even further on that. There are members of the Italian Communist Party, Gus Hole in the CPUSA, and others who I also cite on that front, who identified basically Marcuse as an enemy of the global socialist movement. But I don't really engage, to any great extent with these larger debates, although I am interested in them. It's more just a question of time and personal energy. It's probably, and this would be a good place to wrap up, it's one of the reasons that in doing all of this research, I've realized that, well, what we really need is collective research where everybody can collaborate and people with expertise in various areas, reading particular languages, can bring that to the table. And in fact, some of us have been corresponding about the relationship between Western Marxism and kind of the Eastern European versions of Marxism. And one project that I've been talking with a few different scholars about, and if anybody on the call is interested in this, we might try to do a kind of collective, I don't know what form it will take, but project related to Western Marxism and its impact on the East, but also its Eastern readings. And by West and East, of course, I don't mean these in strictly geographic terms. I mean the imperial core and the colonial periphery, basically. And so that, I think, is a really, really interesting and important question, and would need to be part of something that would flesh out this broader systemic account that I'm trying to develop of Western Marxism and compatible critical theory more generally. Well, thank you all for all of the very rich questions. It's given me a lot to think about and consider. Hopefully, it's been a productive session for all of you as well. We'll wrap up here tomorrow.